I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Duckworth Library at the Young Harris College and the Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest is former Lieutenant Governor, former State Senator, and President of the Georgia Conservancy, Pierre Howard. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
With your permission, I'd like to divide our conversation into three parts. First, your early life. Secondly, your experience as a state senator and lieutenant governor. And lastly, your work as a businessman and president of the Georgia Conservancy. Now, having said that, your family, the Howards, has very deep roots in both Georgia history, Georgia politics, and Georgia law. Let's talk a minute about the Howards.
All right. Well, the Howards came to Georgia back in the early part of the 1800s, and what I have learned about that is that John Howard, who was my great-great-grandfather, came to Georgia from Wilmington, North Carolina, and he died in 1836, so he had to have come here quite a long time before that. And he was working for his father in a shop of some kind in Wilmington, and he got religion at a pretty young age and got saved and wanted to become a preacher. And he did become a Methodist preacher, and so they sent him down to Georgia to preach, and he was one of these itinerant preachers that went around from place to place. And eventually, as he got older and I guess got more influence within the Methodist Church, they gave him a church in Macon. And it was a Vineville Methodist Church, I believe. And so he was in Macon and was on the committee that founded Wesleyan College. He didn't do it by himself. They had a committee that was formed, and the legislature was involved in it. And he also was on the committee that founded Emory University, which kind of ironically or coincidentally became a big part of my political life later. But he was the treasurer of the committee, and the legislature had authorized them to act, and of course they founded Emory first at Oxford in Newton County, and then later it moved on to DeKalb County, near where I grew up. But that was John Howard. He was my great-great-grandfather, and his son, Thomas Coke, C-O-K-E Howard, was born in Macon, and he became a lawyer, and he represented Crawford County in the General Assembly when he was a young man. And I guess they lived over in Crawford and not in Bibb, but at least he did, I guess. But at any rate, he later became the postmaster of Atlanta during the Civil War, Thomas Coke Howard. And he made a very famous speech down at the City Hall after the war during Reconstruction, when the Union generals were treating the people down here so badly. And they had a big public meeting, and they said, I've got the articles from the newspaper, a lot of people were afraid to speak out. And he walked from Kirkwood, which is out in Decatur along the railroad tracks, to Atlanta to make an appearance there at the meeting. And he got up and he said, you know, I realize that you men who are generals down here running the Reconstruction, I know you're not bad people in your hearts. You just got bad people telling you what to do. And they didn't raise their sword to him. He really let them have it. And I think he became quite a hero in the community because of that. But he apparently was a very brilliant speaker. And one of his 13 children was my grandfather, William Sly Howard. And people pronounce it all kind of different funny ways, Shelley and all that, but it's Sly, as you know. He was named for Governor William Sly. And his father and William Sly had gone to New York to practice law, and had stayed up there a short time. And my dad said that a ship sank in the harbor, had some gold on it, and they had their office open on Saturday. Everybody else was closed, so the man came looking for a lawyer and found them open and gave them the case, and they made enough money to come back home. And William Sly went to Augusta, I think he was from Augusta, and ran for governor. And so that's how my grandfather got his name. And my grandfather, well, one more thing I'm going to say about Thomas Coke Howard. He was the executive secretary for Governor Colquitt. And I believe Governor Colquitt's home is down in Baker County. And I've been by there. I haven't ever been inside of it. But I have some manuscripts that Thomas Coke Howard wrote for Governor Colquitt, speeches that he wrote in longhand. And so he had that connection with state government at that time. He may have served in the House as well, Thomas Coke Howard. He did, from Crawford County, I said. And then William Sly Howard was my grandfather. And by that time, the family had moved from Macon. They were in DeKalb County. And they lived at Kirkwood, which is now a community between Atlanta and Decatur. So, as I said, my grandfather, William Sly Howard, was the youngest of 13 children. Some of the family connection is in Dublin, and my grandfather never got to go to college. His father died. There was no money for college. He had about a 10th grade education, and he had to go to work to support his mother. And then he went and studied law read law, as they used to do, in Lawrence County under Judge Birch, who was a relative. And he was down there for a couple of years reading law under Judge Birch. He was sworn in to the bar over in Wrightsville in Johnson County. And back then, you know, the lawyers would just ask questions of the applicant. And that would take 3 or 4 hours. And then if he passed muster, then he would become a lawyer. So that's how he became a lawyer. But he then came back home. And my grandmother was what they call a pistol. She was a woman who had Georgia roots, but she had grown up in Texas with 5 brothers. And Texas back in the late 1800s was kind of rough and tumble place. And she could shoot a gun as well as any man. She could ride a horse as well as any man. And when her father died, his name was Jacques Pierre Duvinage. And people wonder where I got this name that I've got. And they've accused me of all kinds of things about my name, but I got it from my great-grandfather. And my grandmother was tremendously proud of her heritage, and she was very proud of her father. And the Duvinage brothers had come over to America, into New Orleans. And see, our family was run out of France under Louis XV because they were Protestants. They were Huguenots. They had to flee for their lives. And so they fled to Prussia. And by the time they got over here, they were Germans, but they had the French name. They were speaking German. They spoke a lot of different languages, but German was their main language. And this guy I'm named for worked for Bismarck in his library, and he studied to be a priest in the Protestant, I guess the Episcopal Church. And I've got his ring. It's got a cross in it that he got at the University of Heidelberg. But he decided not to do that. I guess, I don't know, maybe it was a celibacy or some reason he didn't want it, he didn't pursue it. But I've got the ring that he got in, when he was studying to be a priest. My dad wore it, but it's too small for my finger. It's an amethyst with a cross inlaid in gold in it. Anyway, the Duvinage brothers came to America, and I don't think they came over here intending to stay. But the man I'm named for started west to go to California, see what that gold rush was all about. And he stopped in Victoria, Texas, and there was a widow there who ran a boarding house in Victoria, the widow Stapp. Her husband had been very involved in the history of Texas. He was a good friend of Sam Houston's, and he was very well known, and still is, in the history of Texas. But anyway, she was a widow, and my great-grandfather fell in love with her, married her, and stayed in Texas. That's how he became the editor of the German-language newspapers in that German part of Texas in the hill country, like in Austin and some of the towns in San Antonio and some of those towns around Kingville, some of those. But Kerrville, I think, is one of them. But they say he served as mayor of Austin, but I'm not positive about it. I think that's true. But when he died, my grandmother and her family all had to move to Mexico City, where her brother had become head of the railroad project. They were going to build a railroad back into Texas. So my grandmother grew up early years in Texas, and then she was in Mexico City for maybe, I would say, middle school into high school. And so she was fluent in Spanish. And she came to Georgia she was engaged to be married, and she came to visit some relatives, and one of them was my grandfather. He was about a fourth cousin, and he was engaged to be married. They fell in love, and she stayed over here and married him, and they made a life here in DeKalb County. And then he ran for solicitor of the Stone Mountain Circuit and got elected. He was a solicitor of about 5 counties. And then he ran for Congress in 1910. They accused him of being married to a Mexican and that sort of thing, but it didn't hold much water because when they met my grandmother, they could see what a wonderful person she was. And you know, he campaigned on a horse. I think he represented Fulton, DeKalb, Rockdale, Newton, and he got elected. And he went to Washington, and he served 8 years in the Congress from the 5th District. Now, that's the Howard family. Then my father, they had 3 children. My Aunt Jacqueline, who married Bill Edwards from Cedartown. He was an eye doctor. And then my Uncle Sly, who was a solicitor of the state court in DeKalb County, and my father, Pierre. And we pronounce it Pierre and not Pierre. But, you know, of course, I've been called everything in the book from pyorrhea when I was in the National Guard. I walked in there one morning, first morning I was there, and they said, line up. And we all lined up, and they said, we're going to call the roll, answer to your name. So I said, Adams, John, here, Sergeant. They got on down to me, and this old sergeant, he looked at my name, he says, Howard, Pyorrhea D. And I answered to it. I didn't want to, I'd let him call me whatever he wanted to. But yeah, I pronounce it Pierre, like Pierre, South Dakota. That's about the only place I've ever been where everybody can pronounce my name is South Dakota. And I don't go there that much. But anyway.
Incidentally, I remember while you were campaigning for lieutenant governor, you said that Pierre is French for Bubba.
Yeah, you know, well, when I decided to run for lieutenant governor, it was a statewide office, of course, and I had been serving in the state senate for 18 years, and people around home are used to that name, and my dad had been in the legislature, and it wasn't anything unusual for them, but a lot of the pundits and the funders, people I was going to for money, said, well, I don't know how you're going to play out in the state. You might do okay over there in DeKalb County, but I don't know how you're going to do in these rural areas. And one of the problems you got, among many, is your name. So we had an announcement over there in Decatur, and Nancy and I were driving to the announcement. And I said, you know, I've got to think of something about that name. And I had majored in French at Georgia. which I never did really advertise when I was running because people think that's kind of funny too. But anyway, I just was interested in it because of my heritage, and I never had taken it in high school. I'd taken Latin. My grandmother was a Latin teacher, and I had taken Latin. So I got up there and I decided to major in French. My dad said, "Why in the hell are you doing that?" I said, "I don't know, I'm just interested in it and I want to learn it." And he says, "Well, I don't know how that's going to get you a job." I said, "Well, I'll figure that out later." But he didn't say anything else. And so on the way to this announcement from Lieutenant Governor, I told Nancy, I've got to do something. So when the press asked me about it, it just popped in my mind. I said, it's not going to be a problem having a name like I've got, Pierre or Pierre, because in Georgia, Pierre's French for Bubba. And that, that thing really took off. I was surprised. They say today it goes viral. It kind of went viral. And Paul Coverdale, who was a very close friend of mine, I want to talk about that later, but he was head of the Peace Corps at the time. And he was making speeches all over the place, all over the world, I guess, and he was using that as one of his joke lines, and the Wall Street Journal picked it up. And I've got a piece of paper there. He sent me a clipping from the Wall Street Journal that had that in it, where he had said that there's a guy down in Georgia saying his name is French for Bubba, Pierre. And he wrote me a little note. It looks like your candidacy is going to be okay. And that was just one interesting thing. I think my opponents kind of got tired of me saying that because we had all these joint appearances, and there were 9 of us running, and I would get up and predictably always say, "Well, you know what my name means in French? It's Bubba." So Bud Stumball told me, he says, "I'm going to puke if you say that one more time." I said, "Well, you better get out of damn air sick bag because I'm going to be saying it a lot."
That's great. Well, you grew up in Decatur.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about my mother's family that I kind of left that out, and I don't want I don't sell her short because she's still living and she might get after me. She's 96 now, but my mother is one of the greatest people I've ever known. I guess most people think that about their mother, but my mother was born in Decatur, and my dad and mother lived on the railroad tracks. Most everybody did because Agnes Scott was on the railroad tracks that goes from Augusta to Atlanta, and most of the streets were near the trolley line that ran right down the railroad tracks along DeKalb Avenue down into Atlanta. So my grandfather, Howard, lived on Howard Street, they named for him, and the Ridleys lived down on Meade Road, down by Oakhurst Grammar School, which is still there. And so my mother and dad went to grammar school together. And my mother told me that when she was in about the 4th grade, she decided that he was just the finest thing she ever did see. And they were friends all the way along and dated some and then later got married, but they knew each other from the 4th grade. And their families were close. And the Ridley family is an interesting family to me because the Howards have gotten maybe a little bit more notoriety around Decatur, but the Ridleys came from over at LaGrange. And my grandmother was from Columbus, Georgia. She was a Woolfolk, and her mother married a guy named Dozier, and she was Miss Dozier, and they came to Atlanta after the Civil War because the Yankees burned out their plantation. They had a big plantation down where the river bends. They call it the Big Bend, right below Columbus in Chattahoochee County. There's a big area there of floodplain fields where they had a cotton plantation down there. So they got burned out, and they came in a wagon to Atlanta. Didn't have anything. And they settled down here behind St. Luke's Episcopal Church in a little house, and they joined that church. I still belong to that church. We've been members there since 1870-something. And I was running for lieutenant governor, and Nancy Schaefer, who's a right-wing Baptist Republican, said I belonged to a social group, the Episcopal Church. It always kind of irked me because my family's been Christians for quite a long time. We got run out of France for being Protestants, so it kind of irked me when she said that. But anyway, it's not a social club; it is an organized religion. But anyway, the Ridley family from LaGrange were in politics down there, and John Ridley, John F. Ridley, my grandfather married Nellie Dozier, and that was my mother's family. My grandfather's grandfather was Senator Ben Hill, and he was from LaGrange. And Ben Hill was a great leader of Georgia. His statue in marble was right outside of my office when I was lieutenant governor.
Benjamin Harvey Hill.
Benjamin Harvey Hill. U.S. Senator Benjamin Harvey Hill. And he was in the Confederate government, and then after the war, he was arrested in LaGrange at his home Bellevue. Bellevue is still an historic site in LaGrange. It's run by the LaGrange Women's Club. The house has been preserved. It's a beautiful place. But the Yankees arrested him in LaGrange and took him to New York. He was in prison there for a period of time after the Civil War, and then he came back and ran for the U.S. Senate and got elected. He had been defeated for governor by Joe Brown, who grew up in Suches, Georgia. I know you know that. But yeah, and that, I had a mountain house at Suches. That's one of my favorite places on the earth. And I always thought about Joe Brown, because when I would go by the place where he grew up, I would think about maybe he did my grandfather a favor, because sometimes when you lose one, you win another one. And my grandfather, great-grandfather, he got to go to the U.S. Senate. And he made a famous speech up there called the Amnesty Speech. We are in the house of our fathers, and we are home to stay, thank God. He was trying to get amnesty for the Southerners who had been a part of the war, and he was trying to convince the U.S. Senate that Georgia was not a bunch of rebels anymore, that we were going to be part of the United States. I saw where the governor of Texas wants to secede, but see, our family doesn't feel like that. We think we're part of the U.S., but we don't want to secede. And so I'm really proud of Ben Hill. He was a great man, I think. And I wanted to just say that my mother's family was involved in public affairs too.
Mm-hmm. So you grew up in Decatur?
Yeah.
Went to Decatur High School?
Yep.
Played tennis?
Yeah, my dad had played tennis at Emory. He had gotten a tennis scholarship to Rice University, and tennis back in those days was not a very widespread sport, and there were a few clay courts around Decatur, and for some reason he took it up and was really good at it and got a scholarship to play at Emory, and so he went to Emory and played tennis there, and got me started when I was a young boy. And I went to Claremont Grammar School, which is right off Claremont Avenue in Decatur, and then I went to Decatur High School. And I played on the team, and I started getting interested in politics about that time because my father, Pierre Howard, had been in the General Assembly back in the 40s when they had the three-governor fight. Mm-hmm. He represented DeKalb County. He was a young guy. And my grandfather, Sly Howard, despised Gene Talmadge. My grandfather, when he was in Congress, became very close to Franklin Roosevelt because Franklin Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Navy, and my grandfather was on the World War I Appropriations Committee, and they became friends. So my grandfather, when he came back to Georgia after losing a race for the U.S. Senate, and Woodrow Wilson had double-crossed him because he was one of Woodrow Wilson's floor leaders in the House. And then when he announced for the Senate, Woodrow Wilson was over in Paris at the Paris peace talks, losing his mind, and he got upset that my grandfather was leaving the House trying to go to the Senate. So he sent a telegram to every chairman of all the county chairmen in Georgia 2 days before the election, calling for my grandfather's defeat. He narrowly lost the race for the U.S. Senate. And after that, he just practiced law and became well known as a defense lawyer in Georgia. And but he was very close to Roosevelt, and he didn't like Gene Talmadge because Gene Talmadge was opposing Roosevelt and sort of got on that Huey Long bandwagon that Roosevelt was bad and needed to be defeated and all that. So they were bitter enemies. When my dad got in the General Assembly, he and Herman Talmadge became good friends. And he voted to allow Talmadge, in the 3-governor fight, he voted for Talmadge in the House. And they gave him hell in DeKalb County. They had rallies against him and everything else, but he survived it. So my mother never did like the political life all that much, and he served a few terms, and then he decided not to run anymore. And they tried to get him to run for Congress and everything else. He never wanted that life. But then when Governor Griffin and Governor Vandiver had talked about closing the schools. And he said, I am not going to sit by and see the schools of this state closed. And he ran for the legislature again to go down there and try to do something to keep the schools open. He wasn't some outlier. I mean, I'm not here to say that he was out pushing for integration or anything like that. He just did not feel that it was right for the schools to be closed, and he did not feel that it was right to defy the Supreme Court. He was a lawyer, and the law was the law to him. And so I handed out cards for him in that election, and I just kind of got the bug. I just liked it, and I was kind of surprised because I was pretty young then, 1962, but I was born in 1943. But anyway, that was the first time I ever really did any campaigning was for him. And I was so aggressive, they ran me out of one polling place, I remember, up at Ponce de Leon School, which is now the old, that's where the post office is in Decatur now. But yeah, I liked it. He won that race. So then, back to the tennis, I played Dan McGill's son, Ham, in a tournament. And Ham was a great tennis player, better than me, but he was 2 years younger, and I beat him in this tournament. His father, Dan McGill, who was the longtime coach of the University of Georgia tennis team, was watching the match. And I had gone with my father up to Davidson College to play in the Southern Open, and Coach Fogelman up there had seen me play, and he offered me a scholarship to Davidson College, and I accepted it. And my life is full of changing my mind. And I got accused of that a lot in politics. They said I was wishy-washy. But sometimes, I think one thing, then I'll just change my mind because I think better. So anyway, Dan McGill called me, and he says, you ought not to go to Davidson. He says, you can't meet anybody up there. He says, come on down here and play for me at Georgia. So I sent Coach Fogelman a letter and told him I was going to Georgia. And that's one of the best things I've ever done, is to go to the University of Georgia, because there's no place like Athens to me. I mean, a big part of my heart is there. But I went over there and played tennis for Georgia. I was so proud to compete with the Georgia G on my sweater. I really loved that, and enjoyed it so much. And Dan McGill, who's still living today, he's up in his 80s, but he's one of the greatest men I've ever known. He's kind of like a surrogate father for me. He was in the Marine Corps, very tough, but the funniest guy I've ever met. And everybody who's ever played for him will tell you the same thing, that he's just one of the greatest people on earth. And I really enjoyed doing that.
You were voted into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I probably honestly didn't deserve it. I think the reason I got in the Tennis Hall of Fame was because I was in political office, but I don't think I was one of the best players that Georgia's ever produced. But I am honored to be in the Tennis Hall of Fame, because tennis was such a big part of my life, and it's a great game.
Then to law school.
Yeah, I decided to go to law school. I thought some about going to the University of Virginia, but I liked Athens so well it was hard for me to leave. So I stayed and went to law school. And I was in school with a lot of brilliant people who were better law students than I was. I was too focused on politics by then. And, you know, they accused me of being a Kennedy liberal when I was in politics here in Georgia, because that didn't ring too well with some people. But the truth of the matter was that I did like the Kennedys. And John F. Kennedy had a big effect on my life, I think, because he had a big effect on my view of public service. And like all people, he, you know, had strengths and weaknesses, but his strengths were so great, and the impression that he made on young people was so strong back then that he really did affect me. And I'll tell you one thing that happened in my life that I think informed the rest of my public service was that speech he made about segregation. And of course, I grew up in a segregated society.
We all did.
We all did. But I mean, I was not like some unusual person that was out there thinking, you know, when I was a little boy that segregation was wrong, because I was taught that you went and drank out of the white water fountain, and that's just the way things were. But when I heard him make that speech, and he said that segregation was a moral issue, ending it was a moral issue for our country. And, you know, I then began to really think about that. And if somebody else had said it, I might not have given it as much thought, but I just came to believe that segregation was an evil thing. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I can say, and I don't think I can be refuted on this, I never used the race issue in my whole life to get a single vote, because I think that is morally reprehensible. And so, I think that John Kennedy was the one that called my attention to that. And so he did have a big effect on my life. And I worked in Bobby Kennedy's campaign too, and tried to help him. And I actually got to meet him. I had a relative, Bobby Troutman, who was kind of about a third cousin, but he was a lawyer here in town, and he had gone to school at Harvard and roomed with Joe Kennedy, the older brother who was killed in the war. And so he was the communications director for JFK at the Los Angeles Convention. And my dad had met JFK. You remember he ran as kind of a conservative Democrat, and against some of the labor positions, and a lot of, as you remember, Marvin Griffin supported him, and he got 62% of the vote in Georgia against Nixon. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it was not like some unusual thing for someone like my father, who at that time was president of an insurance company, to support JFK, but he really liked him when he met him, and we were all for him. And so that's how I kind of got interested in John Kennedy. And then when Senator Robert Kennedy was running for president, he came to Atlanta, and I met him through Bobby Troutman and got interested in his campaign. So I went to law school. I graduated from law school in 1968, and I was sworn into the bar by Judge Jim Barrow, who is Congressman Barrow's,
John Barrow.
Our current Congressman John Barrow from Savannah,
right,
since they redistricted him out of Athens. And that's his father, John Barrow's father. And I went back home, and my father had a heart attack. And they didn't know if he could work again. And he started back to work in a small law practice in Decatur, and I just wanted to be there with him. And so I went in, practiced with him. And we had a great time from 1968 until he died suddenly of a sudden heart attack. I was off fishing, and he died without warning one day, one Sunday afternoon at home, and in 1976, and so I've always regretted that I was not at home then. But anyway, after that, I formed a law firm with Tom Gilliland. And Tom Gilliland's grandfather, Tom Candler, was on the Supreme Court and lived on the square in Blairsville and was a friend of my grandfather's. And Tom and I formed a law firm, and he's had a great career of his own. After that, I won't go into all the gory details of our law practice. It's not that interesting, but we had a long, successful partnership, and then he became a banker in North Georgia. He now serves on the TVA board. He's a very great individual.
1972, the age of 29, you ran for the Georgia State Senate.
Yeah, I was leaving the First National Bank building in Decatur, going to court to represent a client, and we had a sheriff there named Bob Broom, and I think he might have just left office then, but he stopped me and he says, Pierre, have you heard about Bob Walling? I said, no, what's happened to him? He says, well, nothing bad. He's been appointed judge by Jimmy Carter. I said, really? He said, yeah. He says, that seat's open. You ought to run for it. And I had been the lawyer for the DeKalb delegation for a couple of years because I was interested in the General Assembly, but I hadn't really thought about running for the Senate. My father had been in the House, and he always thought the House was the better of the two bodies. That was just what he thought. But when the Senate seat came open, I went up after court and I said, Daddy, Bob Walling's taken a judicial appointment and the seat's open. Bob Broom thinks I ought to run for it. And Dad said, well, you might win. I said, well, do you think it'd be all right if I ran? He says, it'd be all right if you run. I'll try to help you any way I can. So I started trying to figure out how to run, but it was kind of a tough thing because I didn't know the people in a lot of the district. Had a large Jewish population that I didn't know very many people there, and had a large black population. I knew some in that area. I knew the people in Decatur, of course, and I felt they would probably support me, but I had Fred Orr, who is a very brilliant man. He's a trial lawyer today in Atlanta and has had a very successful career. And he had just run for the county commission the election before and had gotten 49% of the vote, and he was well known. And then Joe Cahoon, who had worked for Jim Mackey, who's one of my heroes, who's a congressman from the 4th District. Joe Cahoon was his AA, and he was running. And there were some other able candidates in there. We had I think about 9 of us running. And so I had a friend whose father was a preacher at the Baptist church, Bill Lancaster. And I hired Bill. I didn't have much money to hire anybody, but I paid him a little bit to knock on doors with me. And we knocked on doors for 4 months. And we did some every day. And I learned that at least in the area I was in, people would come to the door then. They didn't want you coming before about 10 o'clock in the morning. They didn't want you coming after it got dark. But if you were brief and pleasant, they would talk to you. And so we just went around and knocked on doors. And I got Kitty Jacobs, whose husband, Harris Jacobs, was a very prominent lawyer in Atlanta. And his father, Joe Jacobs, had been chairman of the Fulton County Democratic Party. So they were very political. And I got her to walk around all the Jewish precincts with me and knock on doors. And Kitty Jacobs was so popular and well liked in the Jewish community that she was able to get me acceptance. And we carried those precincts like 75, 80%. And Morris Finley, who's still in politics, I had gone to him and asked him to run my campaign in the African American community down there. And he wanted me to do a little bit more to make a deal with him than I could do. And so when I called the Democratic Party office to find out who had qualified, at about 1 minute after 12, I found out Morris Finley had qualified against me. I thought he was going to run my campaign. But anyway, that didn't work out too well. But I like Morris. He's a very likable guy. But anyway, at the end of the campaign, I got 50.8% of the vote or something like that, and won that without a runoff, which was surprising to a lot of people. But it really didn't surprise me because I knew that I was outworking everybody else. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Carter told me that I was too lazy to be elected. And I won't get into all that, but I had met Jimmy Carter in 1966, and I really liked him a lot. And so I had told him that I was going to run for the seat. And Lester Maddox had a guy in the race, a guy named King. And he was the man that a lot of the Maddox people were behind. There weren't that many Maddox people out there, fortunately. But anyway, it kind of became a Carter-Maddox thing, sort of. And so I went and saw Governor Carter, and I said, I'm running for the seat. And he says, well, you've never accomplished anything in your life. It'd be good if you could accomplish something. Well, I thought I'd done pretty good. I was Phi Beta Kappa. I was a lawyer. I played tennis. I was captain of the tennis team at the University of Georgia. I was president of my fraternity. I was voted outstanding student at the University of Georgia, freshman, sophomore, and junior year. And he popped that bubble right quick. He said, you're too damn lazy to win this thing. And so I started thinking on the way home, he might be right. So that's when I decided to knock on the doors. He says, if you'll shake hands with everybody twice, you might win. So
well, he should know he's done that.
Mm-hmm.
He's done.
But anyway, I did and got elected. And then I got really in the hot water because I was the dog that caught the car then, because I got down there and, you know, Bob, I don't want to say anything negative about anybody today, because you have political fights, you have political views on things, but I don't think this is too negative. I'll just say that Governor Maddox's beliefs and his politics were at absolute cross purposes with mine. And I came to like him as a person, and I came to respect him because I do feel that what he said and did was what he believed. I just didn't believe it, and I didn't think it was right, and I didn't think that it was right for Georgia. And one of the reasons that I wanted to run for office to begin with was because I wanted Georgia to have a different image in this country. I wanted Georgia to put its best foot forward, and I didn't feel that Governor Maddox was doing that. And so that was one of my motivations for getting into it. It was not just that I wanted to hold the office. I never really just wanted to hold an office because I wanted things to change. Mm-hmm. And I'm still that way. I'm not satisfied with the status quo. And I'm not holding that up as some kind of badge of honor. It's just the way I am. Some people are different, and they like being in the office. They like the things that flow from the office, and they just enjoy serving. They're not too interested in being a change agent. But I'm not that way, and that'll get you in a lot of trouble. I mean, it's easier not to be a change agent. But when I got down to the General Assembly, I was immediately identified as, okay, here comes a Carter guy. He beat the Maddox guy. And I was in the Senate over which Lieutenant Governor Maddox was presiding. Mm-hmm. And I'll have to say that Governor Maddox and I never had a crossword. He was not a man who was like that at all. He was very polite. He was very warm. He was very friendly. And I remember one time that Kitty Jacobs, this woman who had taken me around door to door, asked me to produce Governor Maddox to Emory University where they were having a charity event to raise money for cancer. So we got out there, he agreed to come, and we got out there to the track, and it was on the oval inside the track where they were having the event. And I went and greeted him and brought him down and was introducing him to people. Well, of course, at Emory University, he was not very popular. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've walked this man into a trap. And they came to me and they says, now we're going to have the pie throwing contest. And we would like for Governor Maddox to be, sit in that chair right over there, we're going to throw a pie in his face. I said, oh no, you're not throwing a pie in his face. They said, well, that's the big deal, the pie throwing contest. I says, okay. And this sounds like I'm being a martyr, but I mean, at the moment, I didn't know how to get out of the trap. I says, throw it in my face, not in his face. So they threw it in my face. Well, I saw him about 20 years later. I went to Ms. Maddox's funeral, and I saw him after. And he introduced me to his family. He says, this young man, a long time ago, told him to throw the pie in his face and not my face. So, you know, people remember stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. So when I say those things about Governor Maddox, I don't say it on a personal level. It was just like we had a philosophical difference about how things should be in government. And that's what government's about.
Yeah, what can you tell us about the Carter-Maddox feud?
A lot.
We'll take a break here.
A lot.
Good.
Yeah.
Do you mind?
No,
okay?
I think I should. I think it's important.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Good. What can you tell us about the famous or maybe infamous feud between Governor Jimmy Carter and Lieutenant Governor Maddox while you were in the Senate?
You know, I just don't think they liked each other very much. I think it stemmed from the campaign that Jimmy Carter ran, and he was trying to beat Carl Sanders at that point, and Sanders was viewed as the progressive, and Carter was trying to get voters who wouldn't go toward a progressive candidate. And you remember he stated that he would, if he were governor, he would invite Governor Wallace to come over and visit and speak in Georgia. Sanders had said, if I'm elected, Governor Wallace won't be welcome, something to that effect. And so I think that Governor Maddox felt, I think, he never told me this, I'm just interpreting. Governor Maddox seemed to feel that Carter had used a lot of themes that would attract Maddox voters, but had not been sincere in his appeal. And that at the time that he made the inaugural speech, he says the time for discrimination in Georgia is over. And I was at the speech and heard him say that. And of course I agreed with it and thought it was a great thing to say. Well, his picture immediately appeared on the cover of Time magazine with the Georgia flag interposed around him so that you had the Confederate flag and then you had Jimmy Carter's, you know, attractive picture they had of him, just the headshot. And it's something like, Dixie whistles a different tune, Time magazine. Well, I kind of think that rankled Governor Maddox. And so I think that kind of set up the feud right there. And then Governor Maddox was president of the Senate, and a lot of the guys who were leaders in the Senate didn't like Carter. They had been for Sanders, like Culver Kidd and Gene Holly from Augusta, who was majority leader of the Senate, was a very tough, smart guy, and he was very close to Sanders, and he despised Carter for that reason. And there were a number of other people like that. So the Senate became Carter's problem, his big problem. He was able to get a lot more cooperation in the House of Representatives than he was in the Senate. But after Carter's effort to reorganize state government, which only passed the Senate by 1 or 2 votes in the 2 years before I got there. By the time I got to the Senate, after 2 years of Carter's governorship and 2 years of the feud going on. Then I got there, and the anti-Maddox senators decided that the first thing they would try to do in January of 1973, which was Maddox's third year of being lieutenant governor, was take away his powers to appoint committees. That was the first vote I had to cast. And so both sides were having the new senators over. For Jimmy Carter had us to the mansion. I remember Joe Lee Thompson from Cobb County was there. And I think Ed Barker from Warner Robins, and some other young, Peter Banks, who's now the mayor of Barnesville, Georgia, from Lamar County, he was there. So we went over and had dinner with the governor. Well, going to the governor's mansion, having dinner with the governor, that felt pretty good when I was just elected. I thought, man, this is going to be all right. But I was philosophically on his side anyway. He didn't need to feed me the steak, but I enjoyed it. But I mean, I voted to strip Lester Maddox of his powers. And we lost that fight. That was just purely politics. It didn't have anything to do with personality. It was just Carter versus Maddox. You either for us or you're not. So when you vote to take the lieutenant governor's power to appoint committees away, as I later became more sympathetic with, you know, it's not viewed very well by the presiding officer, and they put me in the basement the next morning. Beverly Langford, who was close to Carter, and I were sharing an office in the basement, and I had one desk. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a blood feud between Carter and Maddox, and I think it just escalated because Carter, Jimmy Carter, whom I greatly admire, may have a little bit more of a mean streak in him than Lester Maddox does. And so somebody said he was kind of like a South Georgia gopher tortoise. I mean, he's tough. And he would send these letters up to the Senate telling them if they voted this way, here's what would happen. And he didn't have a very politic way of communicating sometime with the Senate. And we just had a lot of trouble. And some of it was a result of the Sanders Carter feud from the election, and some of it was a product of maybe Governor Carter using more salt than honey. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe a little bit of a different approach could have softened that some, but that's just not the way politics operated back then.
You're a young man, as I recall, in 1974, when George Busbee was elected governor. He appointed you as a floor leader.
Yeah, you know, I think the reason that happened was there was a great friend of mine and a great man in my estimation, Al Holloway from Dougherty County, Albany, Georgia, was a senator, and he was president pro tem of the Senate. And for some reason, he liked me a lot. I don't know why I attracted his attention, but he kind of befriended me and promoted me, and I guess maybe part of it was because I committed to him early on for the job he wanted and stuck with him always. I really believed in Al Holloway. But he's the one that, he was close to Busbee because they were both from Albany. And so Busbee was trying to find, he's trying to get some diversity, I think, in his leadership team. And Robin Harris from Decatur, who was a close friend of our family, had been one of his campaign managers, or at least was high up in his campaign. And so I think between Al Holloway talking to Busbee and Robin Harris saying it was probably okay to do it, that I got that job. And there were two assistant floor leaders and then a floor leader, and the floor leader was Terrell Starr. And I got one of the assistant positions. But I found out that being a floor leader for a governor isn't all it's cracked up to be. Because you lose a lot of your independence, and there's not a lot of benefit to it. I'm not saying, I liked Governor Busbee, and I believed in what he did. I mean, I remember one of the greatest things he ever did to me was to found the kindergarten program. And I remember the morning we met in Governor Busbee's office. I don't have the year in my mind, but I remember the meeting, and Tom Perdue was in there. Or it may have been Norman Underwood at that point. Norman Underwood, who's another great man from Gordon County, Redbud, Georgia. But I'd gone to school with him, and I just loved Norman Underwood, always have. And he was in there, and they brought the message in that Speaker Tom Murphy had said that the kindergarten proposal was nothing in the world but glorified babysitting, and he was going to oppose it. And they said, Governor, do you want to go forward with this kindergarten proposal? The Speaker's going to be against it. And he's one of your best friends. The Speaker had been a proponent of Governor Busbee. Governor Busbee, of course, had been a House leader. He says, well, Tom's going to have to be on his own on this thing. Let's trot. I never will forget it. He said it just like, let's trot. And he went forward on that kindergarten program and put it into effect, and finally got the Speaker to agree to it. And it's been one of the great things that's ever been done in education. The other one was the Hope Scholarship.
Let's talk for a minute, if you will, about some of your accomplishments as a state senator before you became lieutenant governor. One thing that I recall was a good effort you made on ethics. You had a bill, I think it was in, '86, an ethics bill. Ethics weren't quite popular in those days in the Georgia Capitol.
Well, you know, the one thing I learned a lot as I went through 26 years in public office, and people who propose ethics bills are viewed by their fellow legislators as putting themselves in a holier-than-thou position. And it's not exactly where you want to be, because people can hold grudges about stuff like that. But I guess a number of us came to feel that we need to move forward a little bit on ethics. And you know, I don't think that's a battle that's ever won. I think that no matter how many laws you write, that the ethics of a legislative body is going to be determined by the ethics of the people that are elected more than the laws that are in place. But it does help to have laws in place. So we put forward a pretty strong ethics bill in 1986, and it passed. And it had to do with the gifts you could receive and the reporting. I think we were very heavy on reporting what you got, your campaign contributions, and who they came from, and that sort of thing. We didn't try to, as I recall, we didn't try to make things illegal. We just tried to make it illegal not to let the public know what was going on. You know, who you were getting your money from, and who you were taking gifts from, and so forth. We did a little bit more when I got to be lieutenant governor with ethics in the Senate. But that 1986 bill was just a start. And as I recall, Mike Bowers was pretty involved. Well, no, that wasn't the same bill. That was a subsequent. But that was the first big ethics bill that I got involved in.
How about the Community Care Act?
You know, Community Care Act is probably the best effort that I ever made in politics. Actually, I don't really think I deserve credit for it, but I get a lot of credit for it because my name was on the bill and it got passed. I had a man working for me that came to me from the federal government named Russ Toll, that you know very well. He later became commissioner of the Department of Medicaid, and I think even people who disagreed with Russ had a high opinion of him and felt he was ethical and smart. And but he was working for me, and he came to me out of the blue, and he just said, I've been watching what you've been doing, and I'm working for the federal government right now in health, education, and welfare department, and I want to come work for you. And I said, well, I can't pay you. He said, but Sarah Craig, who's head of HEW in this region, will work it out so that that can be taken care of. That my salary would be paid by the federal government to work in state government for a while. So that's how I went to Lieutenant Governor Miller, and he approved it. And I didn't have any staff for my committee, and I needed it because Governor Miller had made me, Lieutenant Governor Miller had made me chairman of the Health Committee, and Human Resources they called it. And I served as chairman of that committee for 16 years. And I really enjoyed it. And I was thinking maybe I'd like to be chairman of the Judiciary Committee initially, but Roy Barnes wanted that, and I really thought he probably was a little bit better suited for it because he liked being a lawyer more than I did. He really did. I never did care for it all that much. But anyway, he liked it. He still likes it. And so Zell offered me Human Resources, and I was a little reluctant because I didn't know that much about it at the time. But I got into it and liked it a lot. So Russ Toll came to work for me to staff my committee, and we were talking about the terrible problem of elderly people not being able to afford nursing home care, or not wanting to have to go to a nursing home, but needing some help at home. And I have always had a real heart for the elderly. I guess most people like older people, but my grandmother was a big influence in my life, Nellie Ridley, my mother's mother. And during World War II, when my father was in the Navy in the Pacific, we lived with my maternal grandparents, John and Nellie Ridley, and she was a teacher and went back to work to get more money during the war. She was a principal of a school, Clarkston Elementary. So she was, a big influence in my life, and she lived to be 97 years old. And so her pension from the state was $96 a month. That's what her teacher's pension was after her whole life of working as a teacher. So I think I was kind of sensitive to the needs of older people because of my grandmother, and Russ Toll says, I think I know a way that we could get some help for older people to be able to stay in their home and get the medical care they need at home. Now that sounds like a simple thing today, but back then it was not being done, and there was no way to pay for it. So Russ says, I'll do a first draft of a bill, and then we'll look at it. And it became the Community Care Act. And the Community Care Act, in short, was a vehicle for older people who need help at home, like for a nurse to come by and give them a shot, or to come by and make sure they're taking their medicine, or make sure they're getting a bath, or whatever they need medically, to do it in their own home instead of them having to go to the more expensive nursing home. And so we thought we can save money. It can be an intermediate step between a short hospitalization and going straight to a nursing home, and this will save the state money. It'll be better for the people, their quality of life. It'll be better for their family. And the thing really took off after it got into law, and Medicaid reimbursement was made possible for home health care, and really a whole industry grew up around it. The home health care industry grew up around this idea. And I'm not taking credit for the home health care industry, but that was just kind of like the first step that was taken. And Russ Toll deserves really the credit for giving me the idea, and then I took it and pushed it and got a lot of help along the way. But I'm really proud of that because it's still in effect, and I think it's helped a lot of people.
Another area that I remember that you were deeply involved in was sentencing of drug dealers.
Yes, I try to do a lot in that area. I was accused a lot of being soft on crime. I don't really know why, but I guess one thing it came from was when the Supreme Court threw out the death penalty statute in Georgia. I didn't like the way that the Senate came up with solving that problem, and I voted against the new bill, and I think people thought then that I was, anti-death penalty and soft on crime. That's what they said in campaigns. But I don't want to go through all the reasons that I had for having that position, but what I wanted to do with criminal justice was kind of controversial because a lot of the judges didn't like it. I didn't like the fact that a lot of criminal defendants go before a judge and the judge worries about how long they're actually going to stay in jail, and so they'll give them 20 years when they think they really ought to serve about 8. And one thing that I tried to do was to let the sentence mean what it says, kind of like the federal system, where if you get 10 years, you're going to have to serve most of the 10 years. You get good time credit, so you get out a little bit early, but it's not one of these things where there's a guessing game with the sentencing judge is when is the Pardon and Parole Board going to let this guy out? So how long should I give him 20 years so he can serve 8? I tried to do that, and I supported Governor Miller in his effort to be tougher on violent criminals. His 2 strikes and you're out, where if you've been convicted twice of a violent felony, that you have to serve all of your time and up to life. I just think that when an individual commits 2 violent felonies, that we owe it to the public to get that person off the street. And so that's kind of the direction I took. And it started with this bill you're referring to about drug dealers, trying to get a handle on stopping drug dealers, which is kind of, to me, is feeding most of the crime. We've got somebody that works here in this office who's had 3 friends this year in Atlanta, Georgia, who have been the victims of home invasion, rapes, and all of that stuff is driven by drugs. People getting high on drugs and doing these things. So we saw that coming back years ago, that the drug problem was festering, getting worse and worse and worse. And we were trying to get a handle on it, but frankly, Bob, it didn't really work. I don't know what will work, but that was the effort.
Well, let's talk for a minute about health care. You were involved for 16 years as chairman of a committee. It seems that we have the same problems in health care delivery today that we had back then. Is there really a solution?
Well, to me, it's kind of like somebody asking you, is there a cure for cancer? And the answer to the question probably is that you got to first define cancer. And cancer is probably a generic term for many ills. And the answer to getting a cure for cancer is probably going to be finding a cure for many different things that we are lumping under one thing, cancer. So when you say health care, I think, if I were in Washington today, I would be concerned about trying to reform insurance. I think that the insurance industry has gone wild, and my father was president of an insurance company. I'm not against insurance companies, but I think that they've got to be brought we got to get some checks on the way they're dealing with the public. This pre-existing condition problem is huge, and it needs to be solved. We need to get a handle on the cost of health insurance. So you've got the health insurance problem to deal with. Then you've got the access to care problem to deal with. And I'll never forget this. I was in Lumpkin County making a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, and we were in a high school and on the basketball court where they had set up the tables. I was lieutenant governor. And I just noticed up in the bleachers, there was a man sitting up there in overalls, and he had a woman with him I figured was his wife. And I thought he was going to clean up after we left. I didn't know why he was there, but I was just thinking that must be the guy that's going to try to get this place back looking right. So after I spoke, he came down and sought me out and said, Lieutenant Governor Howard, I want to speak to you for a minute about something important. I said, okay. So I went over and sat down with him. He said, I have a sawmill, and I own about 200 acres of land, but I hadn't got any money, and the sawmill is closed because the economy is so bad. And I've got a son that needs insulin every day, and I've got too much land to qualify for Medicaid, and I ain't got enough money to buy the insulin, and my son has got to have insulin by tomorrow. I haven't got any health insurance. I can't afford it. I need some help. So I called a doctor in town that I know, and he got a drug company to agree to provide the man with the insulin. And as far as I know, they did it, for a long time. He wrote me and told me the problem was solved. I tell that not to say that I was so great for doing that for him, because that was part of my job to try to help people, but it pointed out to me that there are a lot of people in this country today who have worked all their life or are still working and can't afford health insurance. And I think that needs to be resolved. I don't know why conservatives and liberals and moderates can't agree that we've got to make it possible for everybody to be able to afford health care for their family. The cost of it, of course, is a problem. But I think one thing that's been left out of the debate that I always thought was really critical was to pay for preventive care. I think that we do interventional care when something bad happens. It's more expensive. And if we could attack the prevention, go at it from a prevention point of view, that needs to be a big part of this bill. And I don't know whether it is or not, because I never have truly understood the bill that's up there.
Before we get into your terms as Lieutenant Governor, I'd like to ask you about the Gang of Five.
Infamous. Some pretty good people in the Gang of Five. Well, when you're a young buck in life, and you see things maybe not going the way you think they ought to go, you think, well, I want to change that. So Governor Zell Miller, who certainly has exceeded in his life anything that any of the five of us have ever done, he was the lieutenant governor. And there were some things about the way he and the senior members were running the Senate that we didn't agree with. And the people involved were Pierre Howard, Roy Barnes, Wayne Garner, Ed Hine, and one more.
Trulock.
Paul Trulock from Climax, Georgia, who's my roommate in college. And so we got together and started talking about what we could do. And we decided that it would be a good idea to come up with some reform legislation. So we said, okay, we're going to, about that time, I think they had the Gang of 8 or something over in China, whatever it was, a Gang of 4 or something. So we just call ourselves a Gang of 5. Or maybe somebody else started calling us that. Well, anyway, we had the press conference and had the bills. And that could have been Lieutenant Governor Miller's term for us. I can't remember, but we became known as the Gang of 5. And we put forward the ethics bill, I think, was one of them. And it's surprising this many years later, I haven't refreshed my memory, but we had some very progressive legislation, at least we thought. And that's where the Gang of 5 came from, because it was viewed, I think, as an attack on the senior leadership of the Senate, and I guess from a philosophical point of view it was. But most of the things that the Gang of 5 were promoting have become law today. We were just a little ahead of our time, like we usually were.
Well, it's 1990, and you decided to run for lieutenant governor. What prompted that decision?
Well, I'd been down there for 18 years, and we had 2 children, Christopher and Caroline, and we had been married for 12 years before our first child came. We had been through a lot of things trying to have a child. it had been a difficult road. And then we had 2 children. Once they finally got it figured out, we had 2 children within 16 months. And I gave a lot of thought when Christopher was born in 1986 to getting out of the Senate. But I didn't do it then, and I remember when I started thinking about running statewide in about 1985. Nathan Dean came up to me. He's a good friend of mine from Rockmart. He says, "You ought to be at home with those babies. You don't need to be in Hayhire making a speech." And I was too stupid to know that he was right then, because I thought I could have it all, you know. But anyway, I guess you asked me why did I run for the lieutenant governorship. I had thought about running for governor. Now that was really dumb, but I mean, I just be honest with you, I had thought about it. And so Zell had some good friends over in DeKalb County, Bill Evans, Jim Miller, Clyde Shepard, and some of them, and they got me at the Petit Auberge, which is a restaurant owned by Clyde Shepard. That would have been probably in '88, and late '88, and they said, "Look, we think it'd be a mistake for you to run against Zell Miller. He's going to run for governor." And you'd probably do pretty good around here, but he's been campaigning for a long time. He's going to be hard to beat. We think you could win the lieutenant governor's race. Now, I didn't really know. They probably didn't think I could win the lieutenant governor's race. They were just trying to get me out of the governor's race. I know that now. But then I thought, they're probably right. So, and I also knew that in my heart, I probably couldn't win the governor's race in 1990, because I did agree that Zell Miller would be almost impossible for me to beat. And so I thought, you see, these things aren't done on, I don't like Zell Miller, I want to run. I mean, it's just whether, you have something you want to contribute, and I felt that I needed to either go up or out, because I could see that I had done what I could do in the Senate in 18 years. And I thought, if I stay there any longer, I'm just going to become one of those people that I'm always complaining about. And I said, I need to either get out of this place or get some power to change things. So as I talked with some friends of mine who were interested in my politics about the idea of running for lieutenant governor, it became more appealing. And so I decided to do it. And they said they would help me. And they really didn't help me all that much, to be quite honest, because I don't know that they weren't wildly enthusiastic about it. But it was the right decision politically for me, and it was a stretch. It's always a stretch for anybody to win a statewide race, unless you're an incumbent, well-liked incumbent or something. But for anybody who's never run before, to win a statewide race is always a stretch, and they always say you can't win. Anybody listening to the sound of my voice 20 years from now, that if somebody tells you can't be elected, they've told everybody that's ever won the same thing, and everybody who's ever lost. So you just never know till you get out there and start going. But that was kind of the way it happened, and I never have really told that before. But I warmed to the idea of trying that first, and that's how.
When the people approved the constitutional amendment creating the office of lieutenant governor, the duties were twofold. First of all, to succeed the governor in case of death or disability, and secondly, to preside over the Senate. But as years evolved, the job became more pressing, and now it's almost a full-time job.
Yeah, the lieutenant governor's handshake came out of the description of the job from the Constitution. The lieutenant governor's handshake is he goes up to the governor to shake hands with him and puts his index finger on the governor's pulse to check it, to see if that heart's still beating. And of course, the hope of every lieutenant governor is that he feels a kind of a weak pulse, you know. But, you know, Governor Miller, when he was lieutenant governor, he tried to abolish the office that he was in. And I think the bill might have passed the Senate and didn't pass the House, or maybe it was the other way around. I guess it passed the Senate and didn't pass the House. I need to ask him why he did that. I never did figure that out. But yeah, I think the lieutenant governor's office is a full-time job today. I mean, arguably, you could quit after the session and go do something else, which I think they did for a long time. But the expectation today is that you're on the job full time. A lot of lieutenant governors have worked at other jobs part time just to support their family, because the thing that's hard is that job pays. When I was down there, it paid about $75,000 a year. Maybe today it pays a little more than that. I don't know exactly, but for most Georgians, $75,000 is a whale of a lot of money. And it's hard to explain to them why you would need another job. The problem is that if you're living in Atlanta, the cost of living has gotten to the point where it's hard to meet the demands of a family, if you've got children, on $75,000 to the level that you would want to. And so some people in the lieutenant governor's office have felt impelled to take, you know, other jobs to support their family while they're trying to serve. But you asked the question, is it a full-time job? It has been made into one. A lot of the things that you do on a daily basis really constitute getting out and meeting obligations to speak. Somebody who supported you down in Valdosta will call and say, we're having the, you know, big dinner, will you come down and speak? It's hard to say no. So you could probably cut some of that out, but I think there's an expectation today that the lieutenant governor be on the job all the time.
You served 8 years as lieutenant governor to Governor Zell Miller. What was your relationship?
Well, I'll tell you. Zell Miller and I were in the foxhole together for a long time, 25 years, or 24 years, I guess, because he was elected lieutenant governor right after I got there. I'd been there 2 years. And a very close friend of mine was running in that race, Max Cleland from DeKalb County, and he was my seatmate and close friend. And I voted for Max, and I think Zell would understand why, because I didn't really know Zell. I knew that he had been executive director of the Democratic Party, and I remember the runoff he had with Mary Hitt, which I don't know that he would remember it with a laugh, but anyway, when he came over to the Senate as lieutenant governor-elect, Paul Coverdale had become a very close friend of mine. He was a Republican, a famous Republican. And he and I had been meeting with Hamilton McWhorter all summer before Zell was elected. And we wanted to revise the rules of the Senate. And we had to meet in the attic above the Senate chamber so nobody would know we were meeting, because Hamilton McWhorter, who I think had been in the CIA, somebody told me, was so secretive about things, he didn't want people to know we were even talking about changing the rules. We came up with a proposal to change the rules of the Senate, and one of the premises was that back to this old thing about who would appoint the committees, and we wanted the new lieutenant governor to have a committee on committees to try to spread out the power a little bit and let the president pro tem and the majority leader be on a committee on committees with the lieutenant governor, and they would select the committee chairman. And we had some other things we wanted. And so we presented that to Zell Miller and John Savage, who was a dentist who ran against Zell Miller for lieutenant governor. And so Zell said he kind of liked the idea, and so did Savage. So they both agreed to the reforms. And when he got elected, he was true to his word. He did it. And so we started off, I think, on a pretty good note. And Zell told me one time that he felt I was always nipping at his heels, and that he thought it helped him do a better job. He said that to me. And you see, I never did really feel that I was nipping at his heels, but we just had some differences, as you would expect, not to agree on everything. The thing that he doesn't understand is that I always supported the thrust of what he was doing, because I always believed that he and I were on the same track and were trying to get to the same train station. We just might have driven it a little faster, a little slower, or put the brake on here or there, but we were going the same direction, and we believed in the same things for the state. Zell Miller was a very progressive lieutenant governor and governor, and he was what I would call a progressive Democrat during those years. He really always believed in education first and foremost, and I agreed with that. He wanted to see the state do something for people who didn't have a voice. And the main thing that drove me in politics was that I wanted to be the voice for those people who did not have lobbyists in the halls and corridors, who needed somebody down there to speak for them. That sounds messianic, but I don't mean it that way. I just mean that I think some people sort of feel that, and some people don't. And that almost, to me, is the difference between the Republican and the Democratic parties, just at the very base of it. And that's kind of the way Zell and I went along. Now, we did have pretty good relations with the business community. And Zell, after he got beat by Herman Talmadge, I think really reached out to the business community in an even bigger way, and became their voice on a lot of things. But I felt that we have today a very warm relationship as a result of all of those years. There were times along the road where we did have some disagreements and things went off track. And I remember one time he had a proposal. He probably today might not do something like this, but at the time he was trying to increase taxes for education. And we had a hearing, and I asked a question, and this was something I shouldn't have said, but I said it, and I think a reporter was there, and I said, well, isn't doing this kind of like putting a Band-Aid on cancer? And Richard Green went running into the lieutenant governor's office. Pierre Howard's in there saying that your proposal's like putting a Band-Aid on cancer. So he went and got Bill, his writer.
Bill Stevens?
No.
Bill Shipp? Bill Burson?
Bill Burson. He got Bill Burson to write him a statement. And he went in there and made it, and he says, Pierre Howard, if he would spend a little less time on the tennis court and a little more time down at the housing projects, understanding the needs of the, he let me have it pretty good. But, we had some things like that. But, I mean, you could say that I caused that by my stupidity running my mouth too much. But except for a few things like that, we got along pretty good, I thought. And I always supported, I can't think of many things he ever proposed that I didn't support, because I thought they were right. And I think that Governor Miller he did many good things, but I think his greatest legacy, and I'm sure he would agree with this probably, is the Hope Scholarship. And I thought it was sort of interesting that my own children were on the Hope Scholarship the whole time they were at the University of Georgia. And, a lot of families like ours have got Zell Miller to thank for this program. And the thing is so unusual about the Hope Scholarship, I haven't understood why more states haven't done it, is that it's been said that it helps people that could afford it anyway. It helps people like families like ours. I could have afforded the tuition. But the thing that's good about the Hope Scholarship is that very thing, that a lot of programs of government don't help middle-class people or people of higher income. But this is merit-based, and so it's not just that you're helping the family avoid having to pay the tuition that they could pay anyway, or it's not just that you're helping the family pay the tuition that they can't pay. Part of it is you're recognizing the child for the achievement of the child, and that helps the child to gain confidence. Right. And it's great on many levels, and that's, you know, a legacy that he's left. And
get something to get something, he says, is the whole basis of that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this question. Knowing that you have to deal with a governor and a Speaker of the House, how does a lieutenant governor go about proposing their own agendas?
Well, I'm reminded of the thing that happened to me one time. You see, before the session, every 2 years they have this big conference up at the University of Georgia for the new legislators, the pre-legislative forum. And one of the big events is the governor speaks at the final luncheon. And so Jack Hill from Reidsville, Senator Jack Hill, had been working since May on the idea of a graduated license for teen drivers. And, previously teenagers has just gotten a license and been able to go drive. But we wanted to have it graduated so that when they were 16, they would have a license. It would have certain limitations on it. And if they got a DUI, they would lose their license for a year. All those things are the law today. And so we had a study committee, and we'd been working on it, and it was going to be my number one proposal in my package. That you asked me, how do you propose laws? So I'm sitting beside Governor Miller, and we have a very pleasant pre-speech conversation. And then he gets up to speak, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, he says, I'm here today to announce my legislative package for the session. And he says, the number one bill is going to be a bill that's going to change driving for teenagers. It's the graduated license. He had taken my bill. And when he sat back down, I said, Governor, that's my bill. He says, well, it's going to do better with my name on it, or something like that. I mean, that's just the life of a lieutenant governor. I mean, he hadn't done anything wrong. It was just, that's the way that works. Mm-hmm. So it is very difficult to get any real traction where when you're working with a governor that wants to get stuff done. If you've got a good idea, there's a chance they're going to take it. And in the larger context, it's a better thing for the governor to put it in. There's a better chance it'll become law. Mm-hmm. But I mean, when the egos get involved, you worry about that. But I think that there's always plenty of room for a lieutenant governor to maneuver. Mm-hmm. The governor's not going to take every idea that you've got, and you're not going to have every good idea. I mean, you have to have a team concept. And one thing that has distressed me about what's going on down there at the General Assembly now under Governor Perdue is that there doesn't seem to be the same sense of teamwork in the Capitol. And I'm speaking here in the year 2009. We've got a governor's race next year, and Governor Perdue's been in there for about 8 years, but there doesn't seem to be a sense of teamwork that we had. And even though, yes, Zell Miller and Tom Murphy fought like cats and dogs, Tom Murphy didn't particularly like me, or at least he made people think that. In person, he was very nice to me. That's a very interesting thing. You can say, oh, Tom Murphy and Pierre Howard hate each other. When we had meetings, he was always very courteous. I was courteous to him. The last time I saw him, he put his arm around me and hugged me. and I introduced my children to him and his family. People don't see these things. They see a lot of politics is theater. You know that because you were in it, but a lot of it's theater. And I don't think Tom Murphy hated me or anything. It was just that there's always a tension between the lieutenant governor and the speaker. It's a natural tension that probably should be there. Mm-hmm. They're not down there to get along on everything. They're down there to try to put their views out there and then come to a meeting of the minds somewhere in the middle, and that's where you get your good results. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that the lieutenant governor has some trouble maneuvering is just part of the job. Mm-hmm. But there's plenty of room, like on the budget. You can get a lot of good things done in the budget, and you can get a lot of good things done working with the governor toward a common objective. And that's most of the stuff that I got done, I did with the governor's blessing before I ever put it in. I would go see him and say, here's what I want to try to do. And he wouldn't always tell me that he was going to push it, but he would say, well, go work on it and then come back and see me, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Should Georgia's governor and lieutenant governor run as a ticket?
Well, I think that there would be some advantages to it, especially from the point of view of the lieutenant governor. He wouldn't have to go raise all that money by himself or herself. But I sort of feel that the way the Capitol's running right now, that it's a little bit broken. And I don't know whether it's a function of the personalities in office or a function of the way the structure's set up. I told Governor Miller when I was in there that I think it would be a good idea for the lieutenant governor to work a little bit more on economic development. But he always wanted to do that himself. He did send me on one trip. It was the best trip that Nancy and I and the children ever took when we were in office. He was planning to go to Germany and Italy on a industry-seeking mission, and he couldn't go at the last minute and sent us. And that was a wonderful experience. But I think the lieutenant governor could do a lot more. It could be given a lot more responsibility than currently is given. And if I were waving a magic wand, I would say they ought to take another look at that. I mean, the Florida model is not too bad, the cabinet model, where the lieutenant governor is part of a team and has more responsibilities than just to preside over the Senate and wait for the governor to get sick or something. I think it's a waste of effort and a waste of talent.
What did you enjoy most about being lieutenant governor?
Having lunch with Wayne Garner. I really think.
Did he pay?
No, not much. No, he paid some. He's the funniest guy. He and Dan McGill are the two funniest people I know, and I just loved working with him. But yeah, I think. I mean, he's not the only one. Paul Coverdale. I was privileged, very privileged, to work with some great people.
There was a lot of camaraderie then.
Yeah.
It was not as partisan as it is today.
I'd like to say a little bit more about that, but I'm getting kind of a little emotional about it.
But here's a question you might not want to answer. Governor Miller said he was only going to run for one term. He changed his mind in 1994 and ran for a second term. Had you made any plans to run?
Well, yeah. He had called me into the office and told me to get ready. If I wanted to run, to get ready and start doing whatever it is I needed to do. And I took him. I started getting ready, and I had geared up and done a lot of things in preparation to run, and I won't go into all that, but we were having a meeting of the GSFIC one day. I think it was GSFIC, and he was presiding, and he, after the meeting, he says, "I need to talk to you." And I said, "Okay." So we went into a little room right off where we had been meeting in one of those big office buildings down there. And he said, he just looked at me and he says, "I can't walk away from it." He said, "I'm going to run again." I said, "I understand."
Were you disappointed?
Yeah, I was because I thought it was my time. I thought I might really have the opportunity then to win. But you know, I told him later. Zell and we've talked about this, and he said, "I feel that I stopped you, a good man, from being governor." And I said, "Well, look, I really think, and I really do believe this, I really think that we got more done together than I could have done if I had run and won. Because in that last term that he served, we did a lot of good stuff for the state. And I never have really been bitter about it at all. At the time, it made me a little bit angry, and I was going to use another term for it, but that didn't last very long, honestly, and so you know, I was upset. I felt a little bit betrayed because I had been told that, you know, one thing was going to happen and then another thing happened. But you know, that's just life and that's politics. People change their minds. And I've changed my mind. He was entitled to change his. I honestly believe that a lot of his supporters, I think maybe the Governor Miller, he probably didn't want to run again at one level because he had served, he had done very well in that first term, and he was going to have to run a race against a guy with all this money, and it turned out to be just a horrible campaign for all of us, because the tide was running strong against the Democrats in '94, even stronger than he and I thought. And I don't know that was the first thing on his list to run again, but I think some supporters of his, you know, probably convinced him. And Virgil Williams asked me to go hunting with him down at his place in Albany. He never had asked me before or since. But he had given me a little pre-warning that maybe that was prearranged, of course, but he got me down there after we hunted. He says, "We're going to ask Zell to run again. I don't know if he's going to do it or not, but I just want you to know." So, I mean, I had an inkling, but I wasn't sure. But you know, Bob, it's not something that I ever think about at all now. It's just something that happened, and I feel proud of my public service and in the offices that I held. So it was fine. Yeah. Oh, there are a couple of things that I did when I was in the Senate and Lieutenant Governor that I would like to mention. One of them is the Peach Program. And the Peach Program was a program that gave welfare recipients job training and education and child care and helped get them off welfare. And that program is still in operation today and has gotten a lot of people off the welfare rolls. And I'm very proud of that. Another thing that I'm proud of is getting the seatbelt law passed. And Speaker Tom Murphy was opposed to that because he thought it was an intrusion into people's personal lives and the government shouldn't be telling them whether to wear a seatbelt or not. But Paul Coverdale had convinced me that it was important. He was the first man in Georgia to ever propose a seatbelt law. And the way we got the first seatbelt law passed was I went over and literally got down on one knee while the speaker was in there and just about begged him to allow us to pass the seatbelt law. And he says, "Well, I'll do it only if the officer can give a ticket if you're doing something else wrong. It was not a primary offense. In other words, you couldn't just be arrested for not wearing your seatbelt. If you were speeding and not wearing your seatbelt, so that's how we started. I wanted it to be a primary offense. So when I got to be lieutenant governor, I knew that he wanted the speed limit raised because he was saying that. So I said, I will never be for that. Over my dead body will we raise the speed limit. We got down in the last part of the session, and he sat over there and said, what do you want to raise the speed limit? I said, I want the seatbelt law. So we traded. That's how that happened. But I put my marker down because I knew that later he'd probably come and say, you know, what is it that we can do to get it settled? And so I just wanted to mention those two things. And one more thing I want to say is that during my time as lieutenant governor, I became convinced that the natural world in Georgia was under threat. And you could see it when I would leave Atlanta to go speak. I could see the red clay scars on the land just going out further and further. And this sprawl is taking more and more trees, and more streams are being degraded. And that's how I really got interested in environmental protection. And I've always been really interested in being outdoors, and I got interested in birding. And I just feel a real strong connection with the land and with the natural world. And so when Governor Miller did Preservation 2000, we preserved, it was really his effort, we preserved 100,000 acres of land in Georgia, which is really a small amount in a sense, but then it seemed like a lot. And then we did the Chattahoochee River campaign, which preserved 13 miles of the Chattahoochee River. And I think one of the things I'm proudest of is that I got $15 million put into the budget to buy land along the Chattahoochee River, and that bought 3 state parks. And I've always, you know, really been proud of that accomplishment. And I went to him and I said, he says, what do you need? I said, Governor, I want to put $15 million in the budget for the Chattahoochee River. He said, wow, that's a lot. I said, well, that's what I want. And he said, how are you going to get the speaker to agree to it? I said, I don't know. He said, well, you know, he wants that lake over there. He was trying to build a lake on the little Tallapoosa River. I said, I'm not for that lake. He said, well, you might have to get for it if you want this money in the budget. He says, by the way, I don't think he'll ever build that. He said, I don't think the Corps of Engineers is going to let him. Yeah. So I just told the speaker I'd support his lake if he'd put the $15 million in the budget, and we did it. Mm-hmm. But I've always been, you know, really proud of that.
Mm-hmm. 1988.
1998,
an open seat in the governor's race.
Mm-hmm.
We all expected you to win, but you withdrew.
Yep.
Why?
Well, you know, timing is everything in politics. And I had spent 26 years in public life. And for a lot of people, they would think, well, you know, the perfect thing would be now for him to run for the open seat because he's wanted to be governor. This is a chance. But I think in judging someone's decision about their life and about their future, you have to look at a lot of different things. And one thing that I want to make clear is that I have never been happier with the decision than with that one. I never regretted the decision. I never looked back and thought I did the wrong thing, because Nancy and I had gotten to the point in our lives where we had just had enough of the public life. People don't, if they haven't been in it, they don't understand that serving in the public life is a lifestyle choice. Mm-hmm. And we had been in the state Senate. In the state Senate, you can go down and you can come back home and you can have a family life. Mm-hmm. We'd had these 2 children, Caroline and Christopher. which, you know, are the joy of our lives. And Christopher just graduated from the University of Georgia, and Caroline has got one more month and she'll be finished. She'll be graduated. At the time that we made that decision, they were 10 and 11. And we had been through a very tough campaign in 1994 against Nancy Schaefer. And I have run against probably 25 or 30 people in my life. And I'm friends with every one of them except for her. And that campaign showed us a part of politics that we hated. And so we, you know, after you've been doing something for 26 years, Nancy and I just were to the point where we did not want that for our family. Mm-hmm. And we felt that serving in the governor's office was a lot different from serving as lieutenant governor, because as lieutenant governor, I could live at home, I could go out and do my job, and then come back home. When you're governor, you live in a fishbowl. You live over there in a place where state patrolmen stay with your children if you've got to go on an industry-seeking mission. And we knew that the transition from being lieutenant governor to being governor, if I got elected, I mean, there was a big question whether a Democrat could win, because as you recall, Roy Barnes beat Guy Milner by a pretty good margin. I think he got 54% of the vote, but at the time I made my decision, that was very, very much up in the air as to whether it was winnable or not, because Guy Milner was going to raise $20 million. He said he was going to spend his own money. He had gotten 49% of the vote against Zell Miller. Zell Miller had won by 30,000 votes. Mm-hmm. And so we knew that that if I did run, raising the money was going to be the main thing, and I was going to be in a room making phone calls most of the time. I wasn't going to be out doing what I love to do, and that is shaking hands with the people. But I went to my I was with Alston & Bird then. I went to my law firm managing partnership committee in the summer of 1997. No, 96. And I told them that I did not want to run for governor, that Nancy and I had decided that it would not be the best thing for our family. That was 2 years before the election. And they let me know right quick that they expected me to get out there and get with it. So I thought, well, you know, I think I'll go and see Alan Seacrest and talk to him a little bit in Washington. We went up there and talked to him. He said he thought it was going to be a dogfight. It might be something we could do, but it would depend on a lot of factors between then and 98, how much money we could get up. So I started out raising some money that fall, and Roy Barnes decided he was going to run. And it was obvious to me that you know, that presented another problem. Well, Roy decided in the end that he was not going to run, and that he would run for lieutenant governor. But as time went by, through the spring, after we went through the session, it just became more and more apparent to me and Nancy that we had made a really bad mistake in sticking our toe in the water. When you run for an office, you've got to feel it in your gut. You've got to be damn sure you want it. You can't halfway do it. And I would tell anybody who ever runs for something, if you don't feel it in your gut, if it feels wrong, you shouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And we knew that, we knew damn well it wasn't the life we wanted for us and our children. Mm-hmm. But yet at the same time, I was thinking, well, I've put all this into it, shouldn't I try? And we went to Arizona in, I think it was June. We stayed out there for 2 weeks, and it was out there that we just decided, you know, we looked at each other and said, this is not we're not doing the right thing. So I decided to get out of it, and I got out in August of '97, and I thought, well, it'll give whoever wants to run plenty of time to get ready, because it was more than about a year and 4 months before the election. So it turned out okay, because Roy was able to jump in there and win it. I would have really felt bad if, a Republican had been elected, because I really wanted a Democrat to be governor, and I was very pleased when he won. But it was a hard decision, but it was the right decision for our family. And in the end, that's the only thing that makes any real difference, is if serving in public life is inconsistent with your ability to be the kind of father you want to be, the kind of husband you want to be, to have the kind of family life you want, then it's no good. And that's been proven time and again. And so that's the reason.
How about life after public service?
It's been, public service was great. I really liked it, but I've liked being out of it more than I liked being in it, which is really something to say, because most people would think that I look back on that and wish I was still down there. But I have enjoyed my life a lot more since. I'm able to concentrate on the things that really mean the most to me, and that is doing stuff with my family. See, if I had run for governor, I would have missed a lot of the growing. Let's say I got elected for 2 terms. I don't know if I could have gotten elected for 1. But if I had been able to avoid the flag problem that Roy had and the problem with the teachers, and I would have never done the outer perimeter, because I just wasn't for that. I'm not for it now. I felt that Governor Barnes got triangulated between the flag and the teachers and the outer perimeter, and he just could never get it over 50% after that. But if I had been elected, our lives, Nancy's, mine, and Christopher's and Caroline's, would have been very different from what they've been since. Mm-hmm. Maybe we would have liked it better than we thought, but I don't think so. But what we've had since has been a very close family, and I've been able to do some things that I've always wanted to do. That is to try to do more to protect the environment. I served on the, Roy Barnes put me on the Natural Resources Committee and board. I served on the board. I was reappointed for a 2nd term, and then the Republicans kicked me off because I took issue with a bill that the governor had down there, and on permit trading, and I wrote a letter to the Senate asking for the defeat of the bill. 3 days later, I was off the board. But I never regretted that either, because I didn't like it that much to begin with, and I felt strongly about that bill. Mm-hmm. And Harold Reheis was over there in the halls and corridors lobbying for the bill when he had not been given the authority of the board to lobby for it, and the man lobbying for it was Joe Tanner. He went to work for him about 2 months later. But I never regretted that at all. I enjoyed my work very much with the Nature Conservancy, and I chaired the board for 3 years, and we've protected a lot of land in this state. I also went on the faculty at the University of Georgia School of Ecology, and really enjoyed my association with the University of Georgia. And I started a company with a guy that I ran against for lieutenant governor, Matt Towery. And I enjoyed that. We raised $6 million in capital. We started the company, and we sold 60% of it to a Canadian company about 4 years later. And so we had a successful venture. I found Matt to be very stimulating to work with. Matt Towery is an idea man. He's got an idea a minute. He'll tell you about 3 of them are going to be bad and the 4th one's going to be great. So somebody has to sit there and say, I don't believe so, I don't believe so. Yeah. But Matt and I got along really well. And for 2 guys that ran against each other for lieutenant governor, one on the Democratic ticket and one on the Republican ticket, we had a great relationship, and we still are strong friends. And so I enjoyed that. And then I decided to see how it would be to just do what I wanted to, tell everybody to go to hell and just do what I wanted to for a while. And then they called me about this job I've got now, which is president of the Georgia Conservancy. Well, the Georgia Conservancy was started in 1968 by a hero of mine named Jim Mackey, who was 4th District Congressman. And I thought to myself when they called me about taking this job on an interim basis that if Mackey were standing here, he'd say, you better go do that. You know, so I said, okay, I'll come down and try to hold it between the ditches until you can get a permanent person. And I was here for about 2-3 months, and they came and said, would you consider staying full time? So I've decided to do it for a while. But I'm very interested in environmental issues and protecting the land, air, and water of this state, and that's what we try to do here. But I have a lot, still have my health, thank God. I survived cancer right after I got out of the governor's race. I got colon cancer, and maybe the good Lord was looking after me in that respect, but I caught it early and I'm fine. But I have so much to be grateful for and thankful for in my life, and so I'm living with that spirit.
If you had your career to do over, would you do anything differently?
You know, I think probably I would. I probably, if I had it to do over again, when Zell Miller told me that he was going to run for governor again, I should have gotten out of politics then, because I wasted 4 years, and I don't say wasted, but I missed 4 years that I could have had better quality time with my children and my wife down at the state capitol when I had already been there for 22 years. And that was a gracious plenty. I mean, there's something to be said for not staying in public life for your whole career. And that's not even a good idea for the public. And so, yeah, I mean, that would have probably been a better move, because I wouldn't have missed those years between, like, when Christopher was 7, 8, and 9. I was away so much, out on the road so much, and I regret that very much. But I feel that I redeemed myself by making a hard decision that a lot of people criticized, but a hard decision to spend time with them and not pursue the public career. So I kind of made a halfway good choice in my life. I wish I'd made a fully better choice by ending it in 1994 and going home.
What was your proudest moment in politics?
It would be a toss-up between the day I left, because I felt I'd made a hard decision, but a good decision, and Nancy and the children were so happy, and I really was happy too. But it was a very proud moment when I was down there at the over there at Georgia Tech, and put my hand up and took the oath as lieutenant governor. I was very proud of that, because to carry 156 out of 159 counties was something that really just meant a lot to me, and it meant to me that the people wanted me to do this job. And it's true. It really is true that they're buying a pig and a poke when they elect somebody, because they don't know everything they're getting. But I mean, just for me at that moment, that was a very proud moment. And another very proud moment for me was when I got that $15 million in the budget to buy land along the Chattahoochee River. That was something that not many people know about, but for me, it meant a lot.
Your biggest disappointment?
I think probably my biggest disappointment was that I was not able to ever get along with Tom Murphy. And I felt that if he and I had been a little bit more on the same wavelength, that we could have gotten a lot more done. A good example is I put money in the budget for a multimodal station, in Atlanta that would have started the movement toward rail, passenger rail in Georgia, and I couldn't get him to go along with it. And there were just a lot of things like that that really bothered me. And another thing that's been a big disappointment to me is that Governor Perdue and the Republicans have dismantled in the last 8 years a lot of the things that Zell Miller and I put in place during our time. And I haven't quite understood this seismic shift that's occurred in Georgia politics, because I honestly felt that in the 1990s, when Zell Miller and I and Tom Murphy and the other people that meant so much to me on both the Democratic and Republican sides were down there, that we got a lot done. And you know, Bob, I thought, we haven't talked about this, but as lieutenant governor, I was the first lieutenant governor to really embrace the idea of bipartisanship. And the Republicans will tell you that today, that I really tried to use a model in the Senate of appointing Republicans to committee chairmanship, putting them in important positions on the Appropriations Committee, and letting everybody be a part of the decision-making process, and it worked. And then when Mark Taylor came into office, he had such a difficult campaign run against him, and I think he was embittered by that, and he went back to a more partisan model. Now, some of the Democratic senators, some of whom switched parties later, did not like my bipartisanship. And I was told by a lot of people, including Tom Murphy and some other names we've mentioned here today, that I was making a bad mistake by being bipartisan. But it was not all done on my part just because I'm a good guy or anything like that. I could see the state moving toward a more bipartisan posture. And I felt that it was good government and good politics to be more bipartisan. And you know, when I ran, a lot of Republicans voted for me, and I think that was part of the reason. And it's been a huge disappointment to me that the state Senate has moved away from that. I was watching television with my daughter right after the Republicans took over the Senate, and I saw Tom Price, who's now in Congress, and some others putting all of the pictures of the Democratic lieutenant governors into a wheelbarrow and wheeling them out of like they were trash. And they never have been hung up again. My daughter says, "Daddy, they're taking your picture down." And I said, "Well, what?" And I went in there and looked, and they were taking the pictures down. They never have gone back up in that room. So it's become very partisan. And that really has bothered me a lot. That probably is my biggest disappointment, is what's going on after I've left.
Finally, how would you like to be remembered?
I think that if anybody, well, first of all, I don't think people remember lieutenant governors very long, to be honest with you. I hope that my family will remember me as somebody who loves them and try to put them first. I hope my friends will remember me as somebody who loves them and cares about them. And for anybody who can remember anything that I did in politics, I hope that they will come to believe that I tried to do the right thing. I never stole anything. I didn't need to steal, and I never did do it for the big mules. I did it for the little people, and that was what motivated me in politics, was to try to give voice to the people who didn't have a voice. And for whatever small number of people remember me in the future, I hope they'll remember that I love the state of Georgia and that I tried to be a voice of the people.